Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Brawn Body Health and Fitness Podcast. Joining me today is Dr. Robert Butler, Director of Performance for the St. Louis Cardinals. Dr. Butler and I are going to be discussing a variety of different considerations as it relates to movement acquisition and skill development in a sport like baseball, and we break it down into a variety of different things such as goal setting and so many other factors and considerations. This is a great episode. I know you're going to love it, and I highly recommend you check out Rob Butler's work online. You can find him on LinkedIn, and we link to that in the description below. And highly recommend you connect with him because, as you'll see today, he is a wealth of knowledge. Enjoy the show. Rob, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to work with you today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Dan. I appreciate this. Should be fun.
So, for people who might not be familiar with you and the amazing work that you've done as it relates to research or maybe in professional baseball, would you mind filling them in a little bit about who you are and all the amazing things that you've done across your career so far?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'd qualify any of it as amazing, but I appreciate the pleasantries. I think honestly, I'm a my story's kind of well subscribed. As I started out as a well below average Division III soccer goalkeeper who was somewhat successful based upon requiring communicating to the people in front of them to do stuff different than what they were currently doing to minimize the shots on goal the other team had. And then also at the same time kind of found a love affair with the idea of biomechanics of running shoes due to some summer jobs and kind of went down the biomechanics pathway, but at the same time really loving the idea of coaching and coaching soccer and have done that continuously, but actually could have done that probably as my other career. And with the coaching kind of came teaching as well. And how do we think about feedback and how do we think about goal setting and how do we think about focus and practice structure and other things like this? Well, fast forward to go down the PhD path. I'm getting into figuring out what I'm going to do as an early professional and find myself really enamored with the idea in 2005 of, hey, we're not talking about the fact that, yes, we're talking about how to prevent ACL tears and we're talking about neuromuscular training and Doc Hewitt's group and everyone's just like all over this stuff. And I happened to be at University of Delaware with Irene Davis, who has given me some great mentorship in footwear design and running biomechanics. The same time, you have Dr. Snyder Macro Labs really focused on the ACL, return to play piece of it. And I kind of found myself, we actually had a satellite grant or a parallel grant to some of the running work that Dr. Davis was doing, focused on how do we use foot orthotics to treat as treatment for knee osteoarthritis and fully developed. Well, like most conservative measures, they tend to work best when you identify the symptoms and presentation early. And at the time, we were really starting to build this large amount of literature related to, post-op ACL is, within 10 years, we're seeing a very high incidence rate of some degenerative changes. And I'm like, oh, that's where I think I can maybe contribute to make the world a little bit better place and contribute to the scientific community. And so started going down this pathway, starting to think about some biomarker work and other things. But, I got to the part of like, why do they show up 10 years later with this early OA? And now I enter the return to play, but different of just what do they leave clinic with? And I get into this wormhole of like, we don't really have any standards. Like at the time, this was before like Ford's paper on the triple hop and the agility. Like this is, I mean, we're not talking when the standards we're talking about are just different. It's less objective. It's more subjective. It's more physician or surgeon based as opposed to like functional testing based. And it's funny now to think like almost 20 years back, like how did I as a soccer coach not think about like, why does return to play based off of hop testing or isoconnect device as opposed to like, what's my preseason standard for fitness, for ability? Kind of think about overall readiness, which I know we'll talk about in the future. So, but in the end, I get into the return to play, basically like, what's the standard that we have people finish rehab with to think about how do they present with OA later and find a lack of standards, find more subjective than objective information, find a lot of this leg compared to the contralateral leg as opposed to some normative information, not thinking about maybe a transition to strength conditioning program, other things related to like how to return the athlete to their previous level of function, which a majority of that is a foundation of fitness and strength to which you add the skill piece to create these high performing athletes. Disconnects certainly, a very solid approach between the medical space and the strength conditioning space, let alone sports science kind of tying in eventually towards the end. And really all I'm still trying to do is how do we connect everyone in support and service of the athlete to create the best version of what that athlete can be.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
that's still where I'm at now. So and now it's just kind of gotten a little bit broader to talk about more skill specific coaches and mental strength and well-being, technology integration, um, performance psychology. So but in the end, it's all about the athlete and how do we help them be the best version of themselves with the resources available without causing more distraction. And so really it's how do we maximize our signal of support as opposed to the noise.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything you said there, Rob. I mean, plain and simple, you have to have a collaborative team-based approach to creating the best possible environment for the athlete to succeed. And as you mentioned, physical therapy is a lot more than just physical, or physical rehabilitation, or physical strength and conditioning is a lot more than just physical. You mentioned sports psychology. There's certainly a mental component to it. There's certainly an overall, supporting an athlete's well-being component to it as well. I got to pick on you a little bit, though. You started with talking about your soccer days and your ACL days, but from what I understand, you're in baseball now. How did you go from
That's right.
soccer and ACLs to baseball?
Well, to be clear, like I was a well below average Division III soccer goalkeeper. I was a well below average right fielder at under 12 in the Calcasieu, Louisiana Little League back in Lake Charles. So the excitement with baseball, actually, when I got to Duke, I started to have some opportunities to consult, and majority was in baseball. I had some opportunities with the EPL, Major League Soccer, NBA, NFL, but the majority of what I worked in at the end of my time at Duke, I was consulting with 3 different teams, kind of on the idea of when you think about the benefits of what scale and structure look like, whether it's a big health system where I was at with Duke or Cleveland Clinic or whatever, it's kind of like what looks like for Major League Baseball with the affiliate system, right? With the academies in the DR, looks very similar to the European model of rugby, football academies, et cetera. Like what does that look like? What does that longitudinal progress feel like, look like? How do we track progress, monitoring, et cetera, et cetera? And so the excitement and the interest that I gravitated to with baseball was the idea of scale, right? And thinking about how do we take some of these basic foundational pieces and scale them? And there are really 2 specific instances that kind of, I think, kind of a tipping point of sorts, if I was to borrow kind of Gladwell's comments. But one is, I think it's one of my students at UNC during my postdoc was in my motor learning class, started a academy in Rwanda, basically trying to get the kids off the streets and using sports as a vehicle to kind of help them progress and develop as citizens of the community. So this is an academy in Kigali, Rwanda, where basically they're taking kids out of landfills to a school structure, to using sport as a vehicle to kind of have them connect and have them feel a bigger purpose, to kind of choosing a different path with their life. Well, so this is, I was with Brian in 2005, 2006. I come back, it's 2013, it's Christmas Eve, and I get a Facebook message from, we'd been connecting since, and he's like, hey, I need your help with something. I said, all right, what do you got? Because at Duke, we actually had students who went over to help with some of the preseason testing, and they do or not preseason, like just testing in Rwanda with FMS and Y balance and just some basic stuff you can do wherever you're at. And he's like, hey, we had a kid tear his ACL, can't see a doctor, can't do whatever. And we simply went back and forth on Facebook Messenger with some of these basic tests we were doing that he could do in the field in Rwanda to think about, hey, what are some next steps related to progression? And obviously, we're not diagnosing the ACL. We're not doing anything that's painful or causing more injury, but what is in his bandwidth of ability to do during this holding period, right? And like fast forward another 10 years, and the kid's been on the national team, and he's been a member of the community and a leader in the community. And I think right now he's like one of like the most successful like plumbers and engineers like in the community. So once again, it was never about just soccer in isolation. It was more about contributing to a larger picture. So that was one. And then honestly, probably my 15 minutes of fame came when I just happened to be consulting with the Blue Jays at the time when Marcus Stroman tore his ACL in 15. Had really a wonderful pair of colleagues at Duke who trusted with getting him back, and I just kind of served as someone to kind of make sure that the car stayed between the ditches a little bit with the rehab and with his progress. And we had 2 great individuals, Nikki Huffman, Jason Shutt, who kind of worked on a day-to-day basis to maximize what he could do at the same time while he was going back to finish his degree. And within the season, kind of returned from the ACL injury and got back to pitching and had a really successful season. And it just helped me understand how looking at some basic benchmarks of what success is or what it isn't, or we used, at the time I was a kind of an adjunct or an interim director at the K Lab, because Dr. Queen had kind of moved on to her next great step at Virginia Tech. But we didn't use the lab that much. We just used the basic metrics. We had an omega wave that he was kind of connected to, and he would do at the right times, and that helped. But the main thing was what in his movement profile changed on a day-to-day basis to affect what was done on a given day, and helped inform Nikki and Jason to talk to each other about, hey, this is what I saw in the morning, this is what we do in the afternoon, that kind of piece, and eventually to his pitching work that year. And so those were kind of the two areas that really kind of, hey, listen, like there may be something here that we can think about that can really help a much larger population, with not making it too complicated, but just making it more streamlined, mainly related to the communication and what the markers of progress and what the targets of progress look like as it relates to what next steps looks like, and what predictable obvious lateralizations or regressions we have based upon a given day, or how he's feeling on based upon training.
Right. You and I have talked about this previously off recording there, Rob, is just the need for some kind of common communication and common language amongst people and providers. And ultimately, that's a very basic thing, our ability to communicate with one another. And you understand what I say, and I understand what you say. But unfortunately, as it relates to the physical medicine and strength and conditioning world, we don't always have that, right? I might call, one exercise a bird dog, and you might call it a quadruped alternating arm and leg extension. It's the same thing, but termed something very different. And ultimately, what I've heard you mention a lot so far is the essential component of taking basic foundations and basic things and being able to scale them. You mentioned that in relation to the baseball model and the rugby model in Europe, of how they kind of have a built-in progression. You go from single A to double A to triple A, and then ultimately the MLB, in rugby, you start at a lower level and progress up to kind of the big leagues, for lack of a better way to put it, of rugby. You have a basic fundamental progression from one step to the next, to the next, to the next. And along that way, there are some kind of standards or minimums that are met, whether that be some kind of number that someone's looking at statistically, or some type of performance metric. And from what I'm understanding, there's not a whole lot of that in our world. And people like you are trying to kind of bring that into our world, because we kind of need it. As we mentioned, how are individuals able to collaborate if they can't understand what each other is saying and they're on completely different wavelengths? And, again, as it relates to a sport like baseball, I feel like that's an area where we have a lot of room to grow, at least in my opinion, because, we're looking at little leagues and that sort of thing, and travel ball teams popping up all over, and we can't even get communication between coaches on when an athlete hits their pitch count. They go from one team to the next team. They pitched out on one team and they go to the next team, and next thing you know, they're pitching and hitting their count 2 days later, just because we can't have effective communication strategies. And again, as we mentioned, this is kind of like those basic fundamental things that I would imagine, if they're not controlled when an athlete is younger, they will later have a detriment in their life and career. And, as you mentioned, based on your example earlier, setting someone up for success in athletics early on can have a profound impact on the rest of their life. I mean, one that can make them a leader in the community, and ultimately, cultivate a more successful life and teach so many different life lessons.
Listen, there are a bunch of influencers, and there's a bunch of social media activity in our area, and I think we're excessively hard on ourselves related to how difficult it is to create a common language. Now, I would say that the majority of kind of models for this is probably from the soccer community in Europe and other areas, but often, like, that's from an athletic standpoint. Like, I don't think we have to look that far. Like, whether or not you like it, if you look at the public school system in the United States, and like You can say it sucks. You can say it's great. Like you can say charters are the next way. You can say school value. But just look at what it's done. And for a large percentage of the population, it's been successful based upon standards that are expected at a next level that were covered at a prior level, and being able to check off whether they were actually covered or not at a level of competency that requires some sort of additional support. And I do think the most important thing is we remember, what are we trying to do? We're trying to help support the player, the athlete, the student, whoever it may be. And so why does my opinion about what the word is matter more than the player's interpretation or the student's interpretation of what I've actually said? And so more often than not, I mean, and you could even go a step further to suggest that, there's plenty of stories about people just misremembering the same exact dialogue of what happened, whether it's the Brian Williams story with the Iraqi freedom, and like there's no intent to it. It's just the way that our brains tend to put things in our long-term memory, and it's rarely clean. And so when we talk about this common language, it's to make sure that we all know what we're talking about, and it's not so when we, from a staffing standpoint, we'll often talk about, we need to understand the reliability of a metric, which is really how consistent is it, and then the validity. And if you look at like true validity, and listen, there's like 10 different ways to look at validity, and you can go to a stats book for that, and that's fine. But I think validity in a context of an organization is, what does it mean consistently to the group as far as being a measurement of? Now, certainly if you want to do some concurrent validity with like a true gold standard, it's fine. But like the foundation is like, what does it really mean for our communication, and what are we going to agree to? Because if we don't agree at that foundational level, then we need to start there.
Right. Start at the foundational level, set your common ground, and then build off of that. So how do you go about setting that foundational level, and how do you go about scaling up? Using your analogy of the school here, how do you take someone from, say, first grade up until freshman or sophomore year as it relates to a sport? Because I know that learning theory and learning strategy as it relates to movement is a big passion of yours. So how does that process go about and occurring, and how do you go about kind of bringing everyone onto the same page, for lack of a better way to put it? Because when it comes to the topic of sport or athletics, regardless of what sport you're looking at, soccer, baseball, whatever, there's a lot of different factors that can play into that, from parents to players to coaches and strength providers and PTs and all that different thing. So how do you go about setting sort of that foundational level one, and then how do you go about implementing your progressions from there?
So I think that when we think about what a curriculum looks like, or what a structure looks like, we're lucky enough to be able to carry this approach really from the Dominican Republic to St. Louis. And so we see what big leaguers look like, and we see what progress looks like, and we see what structure looks like, and physical size and body composition, other things. And so, that's really our internal gold standard, what helps drive what programs are we trying to have to support that. Now, the common language that comes in, someone has to make a decision on it. But that doesn't necessarily mean so a lot of my background starts with the SFMA and the FMS. It's a good place to start. We use some Y balance testing, but not all of that is the exact same as a plug and play of going to a course over the weekend. It has to adapt to what the ecosystem and what the dynamic of the group is. And so, a lot of that is feedback and listening. Before kind of coming in, there was a strong DNS influence. And so the idea of mobility restrictions is different in that space. And so the idea of talking about things more from an active passive standpoint, almost going back to like an examination to describe these things, is what got us to, we're saying the same thing. No different than the rotary stability test with the FMS is something that we've kind of worked through. How does it impact our programming drive, supporting the players? And so we've rethought that with some intentionality of thinking about what's the goal, and then how do we stratify that based upon the information, by having staff that have really taken the model and made it into how they can use it in a way to the information to best support the players. And so a lot of our validity comes from internally being able to look what happens from the DR up to St. Louis, as opposed to some, external paper. That doesn't mean that we don't leverage when we look at, there's very few papers on upper extremity prevention programs, but there's a great paper on handball that we've kind of utilized some similar pieces to. We also established, the main question that we have is when we think about how do the metrics change is really how often do you value following them up or valuing looking at them. And so we have a process that allows us to maintain from an in-season standpoint that happens throughout the affiliates, which is really just a comparison of where they are now and where they've been, and to think about, should we change anything? Should we change anything as it relates to their program? And so really it's a matter of, and so we take that almost to a microcosm of when we look at how, the best part about baseball is there's a game tomorrow. The most difficult part to manage is there's a game tomorrow. And so we often talk about, should we do what's expected tomorrow or today? So when we check in on players when they come to the ballpark, it's like, all right, are they on normal? Or should we do something different than normal? They didn't sleep, nutrition, soreness, et cetera, to think about what their day looks like to optimize them for what 6:40, 7:30, whatever it may be, because that's our window. They're here. What do we do? Now, there's certain things it's like remove from the lineup. Like it's not really the goal. The goal is to see what we can do to change, to adjust based upon the information we have to optimize their readiness for that night.
Yeah, definitely. I love how you have your end goal in mind, which, as we've talked about, that is the most essential thing. You have to be working towards something. If you don't have some kind of goal that you're working towards, then there's no intention behind your action. And every action needs to have a purpose in order to have an effect. I also love the point that you brought up about the importance of assessing, because as you mentioned, baseball is a long season where, professionally, you've got 162 games. So you've got the game that day, but you've also got one tomorrow. So you need to pick up on things very quickly and immediately if something's starting to go awry. And that was something that we recently talked about with Eric DeGatti on the podcast, actually, is he brought up the concept of even just a basic 60-second functional movement type screening method, where he uses it in the strength and conditioning population. He says, look, I've got an hour session with, a group of athletes, and I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on it, but I need to get some kind of baseline for where they're at that day. And if it's different, I need to note it. So, in the world of baseball, maybe, your game yesterday was home, and maybe your game today is away, and you just flew across the country for that game, and you sat down for 5-6 hours out of the day. You're probably going to be a little bit more tight. If I'm the PT or strength coach or AT or whoever working with you, I need to assess that and know that and note it before I continue to work with you. I can't just assume what you're going to present with. I have to assess it and look at it. I also like here you brought up the period of, or the concept of a window, right? I need this player to be good to play from this time to this time when their game is. That's kind of your peak time. It's almost like you're taking a concept like periodization from strength and conditioning and applying it to the day-to-day as it relates to an athlete's performance. I don't need them to be in athletic flow state or whatever term you want to give it at 7 a.m. I need them to be there at 4:05 p.m. for first pitch. So I love those concepts that you brought up there, Rob. And ultimately, I feel like that's something that a lot of people struggle to grasp, especially in, the youth sports realm. Is I don't necessarily see a whole lot of coaches who, look at their athletes and think, what, I need them to peak as it relates to their performance at the game. And I need to allow them to be able to rest and recover and accept that they're not always going to be at, top performance every single minute of the day.
Yeah, I think that it goes back to like, what are we trying to get at with youth sports? And I wish I felt really excited about the youth sport, Ronald, right now, but I think we've got a ways to go to really think about what the focus of it should be. And I still feel like we're a bit into the scholarship chasing model of things, with maybe a generation of parents who are also told there are a bunch of scholarships out there. And now there's the NIL piece, which I think will change things as well. At some point in time, you need to value the long-term physical health and wellness of everyone, and certainly of young children developing behaviors. And all you need to do is go to a youth baseball field or any youth sports event and just listen and not talk, and to think about, do you get more positive or do you get more negative? And as someone who was probably an overtalker as a goalkeeper, I'm still an overtalker as a coach, and probably need to do a much better job of that. But hopefully as I got older and more experience, it's more towards positivity about doing this as opposed to not doing that, or about negatively. And certainly the ways that some children are addressed by adults, it's got a long way to go to just deal with humanization and realizing that this is just a sport. And yes, it's important, and yes, we're here to win, and yes, we're here to compete. There's no doubt about that. But that doesn't mean that it's worth the change in a relationship or making someone feel less than themselves in order to create that win. And I think that I look forward to what the next generation of esports is. I've personally been told to get in the backyard with my kid to throw a baseball at one point in time more. And that kid who completely got turned off to softball the time because of that experience, like 4 years later, she's older, she's more mature, she swings pretty well, and there's no place for her to re-engage in softball as an older kid, because she didn't start it when she was 12 or 10 or 11. And I think we're missing an opportunity for what, like, almost that intramural program at the high school level, to really think about what lifelong health, fitness, wellness looks like. If one of the other things that I've loved for the past 20 years with ACSM is really this whole idea of soccer as medicine, kind of integration coming out of Europe and Denmark, really. But I and soccer is obviously the specific vehicle, and you people who grew up playing it and who didn't. I think we could do the exact same thing domestically, and it's pick a sport, and maybe that's what pickleball eventually turns into. I think it's definitely taken its steps that way. But the idea of having an active community using sport as a way to maintain interest long enough to have some wellness, long-term care of a wellness component is really an important part of it. And so you'd hope that as a kid that these things start. And it's been interesting because I've had my youngest son he's 9 years old, loves baseball, kind of grew up on it. He started when he kind of started to pick up on things. He was 2 when really I started with the Cardinals, so he's kind of it's been his entire life. Loves Yadi Molina, wanted to play catcher until he realized how hard it was to catch. So we're working on that piece of it. But he went from machine pitch with like the spring loaded at 7 and 8 to now it's 9, 10, and it's kid pitch. And no different than when we think about like the back end of rehab. Like there's a readiness piece from the physical development to be able to pitch a ball into a catcher mitt from 45 feet away. As I think through, I mean, one, it's not like there aren't travel ball leagues. Like this is rec baseball. There are travel ball leagues already at this age, and nothing against that, but a lot of that talent that can do that is already taken there. So when we think about what rec baseball looks like, of kids that aren't necessarily doing it year round, aren't doing a travel ball model, there's a small sample of kids that can throw a ball from 45 feet somewhere around what a strike zone looks like for 3 to 4 innings. And to be clear, like they don't go like it's a different pitcher usually every inning. I think they've had some kids go twice, but you feel bad for the kid. And then the umpire has to make the strike zone bigger, so then you feel bad for the batter. And then you wonder, like, what is this game really doing anyway? And then you feel bad for the parents, you feel bad for the coaches, and like, what's the rush, right? What's the rush to have this happen? Like, could we do just a coach pitch, right? What's the purpose, right? Is the purpose excitement and fun? And I mean, it reminds me of T-ball in the outfield, where the outfielders, unless you get a batter, like it's just there's the one batter you face every 5 games or whatever. Like there just isn't a whole lot of action. So what's that connection with the sport that I want to continue doing this? And which I think at times we miss, right? The goal is to want to come back and do it again, not to this stinks and go home and do something else.
Right. Get athletes to fall in love with the game at a young age. How do you take something like that though, like pitching, which there obviously has to be a fundamental skill to do, as you mentioned. You have to throw the ball 45 yards and you have to get it in a general vicinity. how do you take something like that as your big goal and then break it down into smaller goals to teach it? How do
Yeah,
you go
yeah,
about, like, is there a certain number of goals to
yeah.
teach just basic pitching form? Is
Sure.
there a point of too much cueing or not enough cueing? How do you take something so complex like that and then simplify it to the point where you can get a 9 or 10-year-old to throw a ball straight over a 45-foot distance?
Sure. So yeah, so once again, 40, I think you said 45 yards in there.
Oh,
Before
yeah,
you
yeah,
said 45 feet,
45
it's
feet.
45 feet, right? Just to be
Can,
clear. Like
I
it,
was gonna say, can you
um,
imagine a 10-year-old throwing a
yeah.
45-yard
Uh,
straight pitch? I mean, every MLB team would be calling them.
the I honestly think at that age, it's like, how do you teach him how to skip? Like, how do you teach him how to run? And it's a lot of big external type cues, if we want to use a fancy term, but like pay attention to that target, step towards it, and try to hit it. And I think that, like, I think one of the interesting things that kind of came around, like, not, I guess I guess my genetic code doesn't lead to early catching of things in gloves, because my son had a long term, like, just, it was last about a year and a half ago, we really felt comfortable having catch, right? Because just would turn away from the ball or whatever. And so one of the things we started with was using some of the weighted balls, but the underweighted balls, because the reason he would turn away was because it was too heavy, right? I mean, baseball is one of the few sports where literally use the exact same ball from the time you're 7 until the time you're 47. Um, and so it just hard, right? And so we've actually used some of the plyo balls, and then some of the underweighting balls with like normal laces, just to like get comfortable with the mechanics of it. And if you look at some of the motor learning literature, which is kind of neat from the hitting standpoint, like, and particularly the way the ball is, like, try a difference. The more you try with a ball that's not 5.5 ounces, the more your body can adapt and can calibrate. And it's funny because he's super excited. He's like, show me the curve ball. I'm like, dude, just throw the ball through the thing. Like, just like, it's gonna curve naturally because you're not that strong. But I talked a lot. Been lucky enough to talk with Tim Maxey, who's got a long history of strength and conditioning to baseball, and now works centrally with the MLB office in the PA. And um, I feel like there's too much focus at the youth baseball level on funky pitches as opposed to just throwing strikes with a fastball. I mean, I still remember being on a mound when we lived down in Florida, and some kid who's 11 or 12 worried about his curveball, and it's like you're not even hitting the catcher right now with whatever you're doing. Like, let's start there, right? Like, let's start with different parts of the zone with some sort of command before we worry about trying to trick somebody, because the skill just isn't there from the opposing standpoint. And I know it's cool. Like, Grayson's already 9 years old. He's talking about, like, what's a 4 seam, what's a 2 seam, and it's because of the game he plays online, and that's neat, and that shows interest. But it's still just, can you put it into the clown's mouth, right? Like, let's start there. And it's hard to put it in the clown's mouth. It's really difficult, and so particularly going down a slope, and so a lot this first of all, like, how many kids even have that to train and to work on in their backyard? And I still think it goes back to, like, just let's have a catch, let's go back and forth on it, let's have some, you can make some basic mechanical things about where you line up and how to work out of the just the position on the rubber and things of that nature. But I think with kids, the more complex we make it, the harder and more frustrated everyone gets with it. And this kind of goes back to goal setting in some capacity, because when I think about the goals that my son has in third grade, they're pretty basic. It's competency in all areas to get to fourth grade, or 4 main areas to get to fourth grade, and, like, be nice to each other. I feel like sometimes in high performing environments, it's like there's this laundry list of things that are important. Well, if that's the case, none of it's important because you can't get better at it. And so where we've tried to kind of direct some of our internal discussions are like, what are the 3 things we think are important right now to work on in the off season? What are maybe the 2 things with spring training, and what's the one thing during the season that we really need to kind of monitor and track? Now, in a perfect world, you have, like, the player grab onto something that they really value or that somehow connects. Doesn't always connect that way, because the player's going to do that work on their own. You don't need additional motivation or additional reps. Like, they're just going to naturally go to, they love the arm farm. Like, that's what they're going to do. Like, do you really need work? You probably got to actually work against it a little bit, but it's a different discussion. I do think that, what are the fundamental goals that people remember, that people, like, can be intentional with trying to make improvements on? If you're doing that, whether it's in third grade English class or reading class, or you're in the gym, or you're in a training environment, you're in a pretty good spot. And if you wonder if the player really knows what they're doing, like just ask them, hey, what are you working on today? Now, there's a spot for players to say, I'm just playing baseball. Fine. But if we've admitted that we've got to work on something, then when are we going to do that? Like, I don't like, I'm not saying playing the game is like, you better enjoy it to want to work at it. Like, I'm not saying don't enjoy it, but remember, you may have to create the environment differently if you really want to get someone better at something that maybe they're having a hard time working at. Because I guarantee, as a 9-year-old, I don't want to do something I'm not good at. You've got to work at like just the level of learning and integration, but not before you get to that point of frustration where like throw their glove and like I'm out. I'll go in and do something else, right? Like, and so, right, it's all I think. So I'll go back to one of our favorite kindergarten teachers for our kids who said, at the level of concentration but not frustration, there's a tipping point there, where that learning happens. And if you look like like that's it's a kindergarten teacher like trying to get kids just to read, to like do their like letters more fine as opposed to big. And but if you look at like the talent code by it's in there too, right? It's self-correction, error detection. But the second that it makes us it's so big or so enormous that we can't handle it, then we just move on to something else because it's just too much. And so thinking about how do you chunk and how do you size the volume of that improvement or that additional work is really important. And a lot of that goes back to talking to the player and letting them work through their stuff. And all right, what didn't work well? What are we going to do differently next time? Let's try to recreate that. And if it doesn't work out, that's okay. That's why we got another rep. That's why we got all these balls here. That's why we got tomorrow. Like, it doesn't have to happen tomorrow, but the goal is to get there over time to make you a more complete individual, more ready, whatever it is, to enjoy and be successful in what you're doing.
And that's a super easy process to get everyone to buy into, I'm sure. And everyone's just like, yep, I'm okay not being the best today, but in 5 years, I'll get there. Unfortunately, we live in this world of instant gratification where everyone wants everything immediately. And some of the best things take some time to work towards. And in a complex sport like baseball, that tends to be the case. Unfortunately, I've never met someone who just picked up a baseball and magically threw a 95-mile-an-hour fastball right down the middle. I've never met a hitter who can hit a frozen rope 9 times out of 10, using a term from Tony Abatini lately. And I think you hit the nail on the head of understanding what you're doing and why you're doing it. And that's a question that we need to ask, not just as athletes or coaches, but also as PTs and strength and conditioning coaches as well, right? And we can't just be the ones asking that to ourselves. Our athletes should be coming to us and asking that thing. So if I've got a baseball player who rolls in today and we're going to be doing a whole bunch of different rotator cuff and arm exercises, then he should be able to ask me, why are we doing this? What is the purpose? What is the value that this is going to give me? And I should give him an answer, one that has some kind of logical explanation to it, a little bit more than just, to strengthen your arm, it's important for throwing. We have to dig deeper than that. And I appreciate your points previously about the simplicity and keeping things at a basic level. But there's also a certain level of understanding that needs to be put into play if you're a medical provider with what you're doing and why you're doing it. Unfortunately, I can't just give every baseball player that walks in here the same 3 rotator cuff exercises and expect them all to walk out of here with, jacked arms and feeling great and never have an issue again. I also love your point too about keeping the environment in mind, because the right environment can really make or break the success of an athlete in whatever task they're trying to complete. Maybe it's throwing, maybe it's hitting, maybe it's their first time returning to sport after an injury, whether that be, the infamous UCL or shoulder injury in baseball, or maybe it's something more common like the ACL that you mentioned earlier. If it's your first time returning to a sport activity after an injury like that, there's going to be a lot of hesitation. There's going to be some apprehension, and that's normal. But if we do that first time in a controlled environment, such as a PT clinic where I can roll a ball to you and you can reach down and field it cleanly, without any pressure or time constraint, that'll probably go a lot more smoothly than if your first time doing that is on a baseball diamond in the middle of an important game when a 80-mile-an-hour ground ball gets hit your way at short step. You know, paying attention to those little factors that so many people miss, for lack of a better way to put it, such as the environment, are certainly crucial. And it's not just from a PT standpoint, but as you mentioned, a learning strategy standpoint as well. If we go back to the example of the 9-year-old learning baseball, I would imagine they have a lot less pressure to learn to pitch, learn the mechanics, and just generally get a ball in a strike zone if they're doing that in their backyard with no one else watching, as opposed to pitching in front of their team with all their friends that they're going to see at school the next day, especially in some kind of game that has some kind of meaning, because even a 9-year-old will probably tell you they don't want to lose. I know for my own self there, when I was in elementary school, I hated losing stuff. Like, no one ever wanted to be the guy on the losing team. And there's certainly more pressure that comes with being the kid in that position. But that's not to say that we should discourage attempting. It doesn't mean that if you're someone who's still learning the sport, who's not quite, as good as another player or whatever that way, like, that doesn't mean that we don't pitch you. It just means we have to take the right progression to get you comfortable in that position in that game, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it goes back to like, what's your readiness for success? And I think this probably ties into the rehab process you're mentioning a little bit more. And Bill Pliskin and I have been going back and forth in the term of like, what does the R in RTP stand for? And what if it, as opposed to return to play, it's for readiness to play? And I think we think about it differently. I think we'd think about what does preseason expectation looks like for our sport and make that part of the process, as opposed to going to hop testing or even isolated isokinetic testing for the upper extremity or grip strength or whatever it is. Like we have a model of what they were, what the expectation of for what they were, typically based upon some preseason standard. And I think the largest thing that I see kind of when I go back to those models of thinking about your models, like where's the cardiovascular component integrated into the musculoskeletal component to think about the overall, I mean, yes, and the mental piece as well, psychological piece, but to think about the overall readiness for that activity. And I don't think that's any different than what you're saying, like taking that first ground ball in the clinic setting versus taking it during a practice versus taking it in a game, right? Once again, like that's what coaches do, right? We're going to practice something in practice before we put it into a game, right? And be ready for that. What's your readiness for success? And I think that the more we keep the focus on this simple goal, what we're trying to achieve in the right environment that sets up potential for future success, the better chance we have of those individuals that we're serving and supporting to be successful. But it does take a process, and it can take planning, and it likely takes thinking about things differently than we have for quite a period of time.
Yeah, no, you're completely right about that. And I guess that'll kind of lead me into a little bit of a wrap up here, Robert, is how do we go about changing that mainframe? Because, I'm sure you've seen it yourself, but I've certainly seen some individuals in the field, whether that be PT, strength and conditioning, chiropractics, AT, coaching, whatever field you want to refer to here, who seem very resistant to change, and they seem very set in their ways, and I've seen it in baseball where we're just going to go run polls for half an hour because running directly correlates to baseball performance. I've seen it in PT where they just have flow sheets of, these are the shoulder exercises, every shoulder patient does them, these are the knee exercises, every knee patient does them. And ultimately we need to get away from those types of approaches. But how do we go about doing that? How do we go about causing positive change? And how do we know, what decisions to make and determine what our best options are in a time where some people are very pro change and some people are very resistant to change? Where is kind of the best answer?
It's interesting talking about how do we change the dynamic, right? Or how do we change the kind of where the hack culture is going from either a fitness, healthcare, whatever. And I don't know. I think I've done less on social media since joining the organization just because it just isn't any time for it. And granted, I follow people, so maybe I'm just more of a person that takes the information than really put stuff out there. And if we did stuff, it was more just like share amongst staff. Hey, here's some ideas to think about and the things to talk about. But earlier this week, I had a post about, it'll be interesting, the real pivot that will happen, I think. And once again, it could be another tipping point. I've used them, to be clear, I've used the term tipping point more in this discussion that I have in the past 10 years. So I'm not sure what it is, but maybe they should buy the book or read it or whatever, and then I'll get some Gladwell dollars from it. But this whole culture of like do what the pros do or train like the pros train, and you know, the funny part is of working with pros for the past 10 years is very few pros train that way. And so when you see the fitness bands that the elite athletes wear and they have the highest output and all this other stuff, I really think it makes the population like it's excited about it, but it's also disconnected from it because I could never be that. I could never be to that level. So the majority of pros are not training like the pros. They're just training like the majority of people, which is a purposeful plan to get better on a day-to-day basis. And so when we find that dynamic that has that transparency to it, that has that level of reality to it, I think that's how we change it. And we don't change it through yelling or finger pointing or citations or, I mean, it's the one thing about doing the publications we've had and being involved with the grants we've had. Like, I don't know any of that work is as impactful as some of the discussions you can have on a day-to-day basis to let people understand the why behind what you're trying to accomplish and what you're trying to do for them or for the community or whatever it is. The why statement's way more impactful than any conclusion I've written for any of the papers. And I'm not suggesting the papers were particularly good. It's just it's how do things get done? It's get done with a sense of why and a sense of purpose. And I also think it doesn't come from like running from the dialogue. Like if someone says something that's just out of left field, it's ask a question. Is this really what you intended? Is this really, what we know is best to connect? Or is this just something to get attention? And those are two entirely different things. And I'm not saying the thing to get attention isn't worthwhile for that person. It's just not hoping to have as large of an impact that you may be trying to have by explaining your why statement and talking beyond that. And so I think when you talk about changing a narrative, it's very different than changing someone's business plan. And when we think about like how do we support individuals, and even whether it's in a larger organization, it's some of that discussion, particularly related to off-season training and where they go. Like the main thing is they do the training, and so whoever inspires them the most to maintain the consistency, the level of intensity, like that's what we want to. That's where you should go. But understand that you're not the first, you won't be the last, and in the end, there are plenty of people that this has been successful for, and plenty of people that it hasn't been successful for. I mean, one of the most well-renowned, largest programs, the sheet of paper hasn't changed in 20 years, or at least 10, excuse me. But the connection with the brand and the connection with what that brand entails has provided a level of support that honestly, some teams just haven't been able to provide from an off-season training planning standpoint. And so it fills a gap. It fills a gap. And so I think what I hope when we hope to change that narrative from a long-term perspective, we need to fill that gap of communication and how do we create behavior change that promotes progress as opposed to a lot of excitement followed by a lot of regress, right? I mean, why does the couch to 5K model is really great. The only thing better would be if people would use that for everyone. Like it's better to walk for 10 minutes than to not run because it takes you 10 minutes to find your clothes. It takes you 5 minutes to stretch. It takes you 30 minutes to run to have any value. And then it takes you 5 minutes to drink your water bottle after. Like just doing something consistently is way better than doing the thing that you value to be perfect. And I think we often get lost up into what some model of optimal is, as opposed to small progressive gains on a day-to-day basis. And that's physical, that's behavioral, that's mental, that's sleep, it's anything, which goes back to something we talked about. Like, what are the fundamental things? What are the three things you want to get better at on a day-to-day basis? And there are times where three's too many. So what's the one thing? What's the one thing that drives you? What's the one thing you want to focus on? Just do that on a day-to-day basis, and you'll be better than 99.9% of the population.
I
Not saying
love
that those people are bad, but just it's really hard to continually make progress. It's really hard. And we try to make it look too easy, and it's not. Really difficult.
I love that point. It is very difficult to continue to make progress. And I love a lot of the things that you brought up there, Rob. From first off, I mean, I can't tell you how many places I see advertising, train like the pros with our strength and conditioning program. And then they'll smoke an athlete with 3 to 4 hours of strength and speed and conditioning and all these other things on top of the practice, on top of high school or college life, on top of their already existing training level. And I'm not a professional athlete myself. I've had the privilege of working with some in the past, but I don't believe that most professional athletes have full-time class load and go to practice and train 3 to 4 hours additionally on top of that, and have to worry about all the other stresses and demands of school and life in your teenage years, for lack of a better way to put it. And I could be wrong about that. But to me, train like the pros does not tell the full story. And to your point as well, we often look for the optimal approach to things. And a lot of times there is no optimal approach. There is no one way. There is no perfect way. How I cued the squat earlier today for one athlete that I was working with is very different than how I cued the squat for another athlete. Both got benefit from it, same exercise, but the cueing was different. The outcome was different. So how come, I can't just use the same thing and get the same result every time? Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. And those squat patterns looked very different for those athletes. One was certainly more a quote unquote knee dominant squatter, and one was certainly more of a quote unquote hip dominant squatter. And that doesn't mean that one is right and one is wrong. It's just that's how their body moves. And when we get so caught up in some of these conversations like optimal movement pattern or optimal motion, we kind of forget that the body's always going to sacrifice movement quality for movement quantity. That's a great line that I've heard from a number of great individuals in the human movement realm in the past. And ultimately, we need to prep athletes to solve movement strategies, for lack of a better way to put it, in their sport. And I think, if we just focus on the optimal training approach all the time, unfortunately, most of sport does not look like optimal training. While squat is a great exercise to build leg strength, I don't see a whole lot of pitchers going through a squat motion on the day-to-day when they're pitching. So a lot of great points to keep in mind there. And I really appreciate your insight and all the advice that you've offered on communication and collaboration and all of the additional things that we should be looking to do as providers and coaches that work with athletes, because as we've alluded to, we can all be better, myself included, and none of us are perfect. So the minute we stop striving to improve is the minute that we ultimately fail.
It's interesting. The term optimal, I've actually struggled with a lot more with being now seeing it at a higher level or a larger scale level. And so I think some of it goes back down to like not trying to get too cute with it, but like, what's the standard and what does that standard lead to? And can you be above the standard? Can you be below the standard? And what does that criteria mean? And so but I think the words matter, right? And I think the word, I think optimal is still a word that I think we all know what it means, but I still think there's a little bit more variability there than just standard, right? And outlining an expectation, and more so like what's the quote unquote validity of the term standard, because I don't know that optimal means the same thing to the same number of people. I think that maybe most efficient, but then most efficient to the highest level. What's that highest level? Assume I don't know. I do think that I may get a little bit too fine tooth with that one, but it is one where I used to use a lot more than I currently do, because I feel like there's a level of grayness there that I wish I could clarify more succinctly, and I just haven't found the ability to yet. So, but it's certainly an interesting term, and I think it goes back to what we talked about earlier, like understanding what that word really means, so that you and I are talking about something similar as opposed to me talking about you looking at it from one way or I'm looking from another way. So at least we're all talking about the same construct and providing a similar opinion about the same thing.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And that even makes me think a little bit back to a conversation I had with Brent Brookbush on the podcast back in the fall there about the assumptions made in the PT and rehabilitation field, because we assume a lot of things. So, if we talk with someone, whether we're PT, coach, whatever, and we hear their goal is, hey, I'm going to go back out and I'm going to throw a 90-mile-an-hour fastball, like we make a lot of assumptions just by stopping there. Maybe we should take it a step further and say, okay, so you want to throw a 90-mile-an-hour fastball. Well, do you want to be doing that in a game setting or a practice setting? What kind of environment, going back to what we talked about earlier? What kind of situations are you going to need to throw that pitch in? Because emotionally charged situations lead to different outcomes than emotionally chill situations, right? If you're in the bottom of the ninth with a, bases loaded, full count, and you're the pitcher, that's a much different situation than first inning of the game, first batter stepping into the box. So taking it a step further and actually understanding, not just, as we mentioned, not just the physical demand or the basic demand, but really filling in all those fine little details and fine lines along the way.
Yeah, and that's where the gaps are, right?
Yep.
Like that's where you want to, like, I've never minded anything new, because when you have a process and a structure that's outlined, it's like, all right, where does this fit? Does this fit to more objectively or more succinctly, with fewer words or fewer gray area, define this construct we're looking at? Or is it a lateralization as another option when we're trying to create progress to a variable somewhere else? Or is it something we haven't even put into our matrix before to even think it through? And not that matrix always exists, or the decision-making tree, or whatever you think of it is always about objective measurements. Because in the end, if the subjective is more value to us than the objective, or we haven't determined the objective to fill that gap that the subjective already has a good placeholder for, there's no reason to redefine the wheel or to remake something that currently works, and there's a clear validity to. And so, knowing where that gap is, and I'd simply go back to the whole return to play process. If your return to play doesn't involve, return to play is fine, but do they have readiness to play or readiness to participate? And those are entirely two different things when you think about it. When you think about the return to play literature, I think IJSPT actually just a year or two ago actually had the first set of papers that talked about neurologic changes beyond the musculoskeletal and the obvious things we look at from tests, outpatient testing and whatnot, but talked about energy systems, like all these things that would feed into what an athlete or even any occupational health setting would expect before they started a job. That's where the readiness to play ends with. And then you think about, okay, where were they back to when the injury happened? Particularly, pitcher or outfielder, how many at-bats were they taking? What was their exit velocity? What was their throwing velocity? What was their daily workload looking like, or baseball activity? All these things tie into, are they ready to participate at a level similar to prior to going into the rehab setting? And I really respect a ton of the work that's been done to the RTP process now. But I mean, for lower body in soccer, until we start including GPS and heart rate response and small-sided games and the volumes associated with it, and the decelerations and accelerations, or until we think about, from a baseball standpoint, of thinking about the bases traveled, the speed, the accelerations, all these different things, or particularly for throwers, thinking about spin rates, like there's a gap there. There's a gap there. And so what do we define as a gap that we're trying to close or trying to solve? versus not even knowing there's a gap there or thinking that there isn't a gap there. And
Right.
certainly I'd prefer to have an awareness of, hey, listen, we haven't done this yet. We're not sure exactly how. We're always going to be on the lookout to address that. As opposed to thinking, no, it's taken care of and it's not a concern.
Right. So after people recognize the gap, Rob, do you have any resources that people might, be inclined to look into to help kind of take things a step further and continue to learn? Or, I know you're a big research guy yourself. Where can people find your publications at? Because, I know you seem like a pretty humble guy. I'll brag for you though. You've done some impressive work in the field of orthopedic sports research, biomechanics, and human movement. Your work is very impactful. So where can people find your work and other impactful work at online?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest with you. The majority of stuff's available in some electronic format behind some Elsevier paywall. So if you can find a good old college login to see that they still have access to that, you're probably about as good as you're going to be. So, um, but but I really, a lot of the work now where I see it's kind of one of the areas where I do keep an eye out for what's happening on the social media front to basically see, hey, what are some things that are happening related to presentations, particularly when conferences pop up, because it's going to be a little more active, a little more upfront than what you see waiting for that paper to come out a year and a half or so later when that publication happens. So a lot of it now, what I'll pay attention to is what happens at conferences, what happens in some keynote presentations that may drive some further up discussions, and it's not dissimilar from when I was during my graduate work, like recommended by a number of people, just reach out to PIs, reach out to investigators. They'll talk to you about it. They'll let you know. Very few people want to hold stuff, and there's a reason for it, and there's a strategy for it. But certainly, if we're not competing for grants, they're going to be a little more open typically with you um, than otherwise. But yeah, I also think that the majority of what's going to make us better probably is going to end up in some randomized control trial somewhere, or at least not anytime soon. And I hope it doesn't take that long for us to make a difference in the world we're trying to create and the betterment of our community. So doing the simple things consistently, having a positive attitude about it, and asking for clarification of simple goal setting and things that deliver goals and develop proper learning environments. I think if you get that third grade classroom right for the community, we're going to be in a lot better place.
I completely agree with you, Rob. And, that's where things like social media have really come into play too, because it's a lot easier to connect with all these amazing people online now compared to when it was maybe 20 or so years ago. I mean, did they have the internet when you were going through school, Rob, or?
It's we always got jokes. I
Oh,
love these
always.
jokes. These are wonderful jokes. I
Um,
will tell you this: my during my postdoc, my students set up my Facebook account, so that happened. My first year of undergrad was like the first email I ever got, and it was definitely on a DOS platform. And I do remember my AOL email address. So listen, I've dated. I can date myself. I'll date myself with. I was a big mixed CD, mixed tape guy. First CDs were Billy Joel Stormfront and Skid Row's debut album, and the exact same holiday extravaganza. Um, so yeah, I've got some age on me. I've got cassette tapes. I had one 8 track, um, and but now everything's iTunes. So what were we doing anyway?
so I guess that means if people want to find you on social media, they better start with MySpace, or have you?
I stayed away from MySpace. I stayed away from MySpace. Um, I probably the place where I'll share the most content right now is LinkedIn. I do have a Twitter account that I've pivoted off after the recent CEO transition, but I may pivot back now with the current CEO transition. So we'll see how that goes. But yeah, I think probably the best place right now would be my LinkedIn page to share information where I see really good content and to connect with professionals to really help learn and help grow on a day-to-day basis.
Awesome. So we will link to your LinkedIn profile and your ResearchGate profile in the description below. So that way, if people listening want to connect with you or check out any of your research work over the past several years. They'll be able to find that there.
Is
Rob,
ResearchGate really a thing? Like, do people think that's a real thing?
uh, it depends on who you ask, I guess.
No, it's funny. Like, I still remember being at Duke, I think, when it popped up, and I was like, someone was like, "Get your ResearchGate," and I'm like, "Sure." And
Uh,
it updates me, and I get an email every week. But I don't know that people who I'm still interested to learn how people who uh how they use it, right? To complete honesty, it's a very interesting ecosystem that is the ResearchGate community.
Yeah, it definitely is, and I'll be completely honest. I use it for keeping tabs on some of the individuals whose publications I've found a lot of benefit from in the past. Otherwise, I don't use it a ton, but
Yeah,
names like you, Mike Lair, Phil Plisky, they're all kind of my top search ones usually on there.
yeah. You may want to refresh your browser a little bit to see if you can get a little more action there. So anyway,
It's been a pleasure talking with you today, Rob. I really appreciate your time and all of your insight and experience that you've shared with us today.
yeah. Thanks, Dan. This has been great. Hopefully, it's useful for other people, and as always, feel free to reach out how I can help.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Brawn Body Health and Fitness Podcast. If you liked this episode, please make sure to share it with a friend, subscribe so you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes, and leave a review. This way we can spread knowledge and motivation and help reach more people. Thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time.